Yeah, it's October. Yeah, I'm wearing a tank top. Hey, it's Texas. Am I happy about it? Hey, it's Erin, and today I'm gonna start a new series that I've been thinking about for a while. So this new series I'm calling Book Pairings, and I could also maybe call it The Great Conversation, but that sounds a little pretentious, but the term is apt. So in some book circles, people talk about the Great Conversation. And this is just essentially, like I said, it sounds a little pretentious, but it's essentially the idea that classics have been in conversation with each other for a really long time. So we like to talk about like classic adaptations or reimaginings, and that is definitely like a cool thing, but it's not a new thing. It's been happening for a really long time. But this isn't like a contemporary and classic reimaginings of classic works, which is part of the reason I'm calling it book pairings. These are instead books, some of the books that I feature will be reimaginings or updates of classic works, but some of the works really are just in conversation with each other in some way. They reference each other, they reach back to a theme, or the book is just like involved a lot in the story of in the other story, something like that. So I think it'll become a little bit more clear as I kind of talk about the sets of books that I have chosen for this first installment. This will just be kind of like a periodic series. Basically, whenever I read a handful of books or think of some that I've already read that are in conversation with each other, I'll make a video. Since I'm talking about pairs of books, I'll keep it to 3 or 4 per video, just so the video doesn't get enormously long, because I'll tell you a little bit about each book and then also how they kind of like are in conversation with each other. So the 3 pairs that I've picked for this video are a little bit varied, and I wanted to kind of explore the range of this idea a little bit in the first installment so you can kind of see what we're talking about. So the first set of books are both classics, and they are books that are in conversation with each other in that kind of broader way that I was talking about. One's not an adaptation of the other. So the books that I'm talking about are Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen and The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. Northanger Abbey is about a young girl named Catherine Morland. She is the oldest daughter of a country parson who has a lot of children, and the kind of like wealthy neighbors nearby have kind of like taken an interest in Catherine, and they invite her to come spend some time with them in Bath, which is a great opportunity for her because it gives her the opportunity to just meet more people. In her little village where she lives, there's not really anybody to talk to, and it's not like she can go off to college because she's a girl. So she goes to Bath, and she meets a girl named Isabella Thorpe, who becomes her bestest friend in the whole world, and she also meets a guy named Henry Tilney, who she kind of likes. And a lot of the story is actually more just about Catherine growing up. But one of the things about Catherine is that she loves reading novels, and she is especially fond of Gothic novels. And some of the mistakes that she makes are kind of serious ones, are because she's kind of like reading the world through this lens of the Gothic fiction, which is not how the world really works. In Northanger Abbey, Catherine and Isabella read and discuss The Mysteries of Udolpho, and I think Henry has also read this. The Mysteries of Udolpho was enormously popular, and Austen knew that. Her original audience would have been very familiar with the book, like culturally, if they hadn't read it themselves. So The Mysteries of Udolpho is about this young girl named Emily St. Aubert. She's French. She lives this idyllic, wonderful life with her parents. She's like, I don't think she's super rich, but she's not super poor either. She's kind of starting to fall in love with this cute guy, and then her parents both die, and she's left under the guardianship of this woman who like basically sells Emily to this guy named Montoni, and he like drags her to his castle in Italy that's like half falling down, and also there are bandits and lots of drama. And it's kind of like the early 18th or the early 19th century version of like the Vampire Diaries or something. It's a little ridiculous, but also like really interesting and weirdly compelling. So you don't have to read Northanger Abbey you don't have to read the Mysteries of Udolpho to know what's going on in Northanger Abbey. I read Northanger Abbey a number of times before I read the Mysteries of Udolpho, and I actually read the Mysteries of Udolpho for a class, and then we read Northanger Abbey, and it just adds this extra layer of appreciation because you understand how just like really kind of larger than life and crazy everything is in this book, and it helps you understand Catherine's kind of psychological state, and also just Austen is generally making fun of Gothic novels, and specifically this one, and so it's an interesting way of kind of like entering into the conversation that Austen is deliberately having with this book. So I recommend the Mysteries of Udolpho of its own sake, especially if you like the kind of like Gothic fiction. It's spooky but also a little bit corny, and you definitely will roll your eyes sometimes, but it's kind of like hilarious also, and very enjoyable and gripping. Like, it's a long book, and I remember just flying through it. Also, if you haven't read Northanger Abbey, you should. I found Northanger Abbey probably the easiest of Austen's books to read and follow. The plot is pretty simple, and it was her earliest book, so it's maybe a little bit less complex than some of the better known ones, which actually just means that it's easier to follow. So if you want to read Austen but are having trouble, check it out. The next pairing is a classic work with a contemporary work, a really contemporary work. This book was actually just released like a couple of weeks ago, and I was really interested in it because it's a kind of like self-conscious conversation with another classic work. And honestly, I think I need to read the classic, well, okay. So the books are And the Ocean Was Our Sky by Patrick Ness, which is from the library, and of course the sticker covers his title, but look at this cover, it's beautiful. And Moby Dick. So it's been five or 6 years since I've read Moby Dick, and I feel like if the book was fresher in my mind, I would be able to speak more articulately about the ways in which And the Ocean Was Our Sky is in conversation with Moby Dick, but I will attempt to do it justice and fail. So, Moby Dick by Herman Melville is a book about a whale and about whales and about whaling. If you are at all curious about whaling, you should read this book because it's very informative, maybe too informative. I joke that Moby Dick teaches you everything you didn't know you wanted to know about whales. So the story is about this narrator. His name is Ishmael, or he says, call me Ishmael, so maybe it's actually not his name. We don't know. Anyway, Ishmael is a sailor, and he signs up to be on the crew of the Pequod, which is a whaling ship, and the ship goes out whaling, except after the ship has been out from port for a little while, everybody finds out their captain's a little crazy. His name is Ahab, and he's obsessed with finding the great white whale. He was in some kind of like accident involving a whale and lost his leg, and he has this like, he's crazy basically, but this crazy desire to chase down the whale. So they sail around the world, and Ishmael tells us a lot about the places that they visit and whales and their perception in different cultures, and we find out like how they catch the whales and how like what they did with them after they caught them, how they break down the blubber, and just like I said, more than you ever want to know about whales. If you have a problem with the reading about animals dying, don't read Moby Dick. The end is actually really good. It's very dramatic, and don't forget to read the epilogue. The thing about Moby Dick is it thinks a lot about like nature and God and people and like where is our place in the world actually. Like Ahab is railing against this whale, but he's actually kind of just railing against the world, and the whale just happens to be the like representative of that. So it gets quite deep at times if you read it carefully. I actually really enjoyed this despite my snarky comments when I did read it, and I wish that I had time to reread it, especially now that I've read And the Ocean Was Our Sky. So And the Ocean Was Our Sky, it basically takes Moby Dick and it literally inverts it, like Moby Dick and the Ocean Was Our Sky. So this is told from the point of view of a whale. She actually starts, the opening line of Moby Dick is, call me Ishmael, is the first sentence. And this one says, call me Bathsheba. Ooh, Claire. It's illustrated, by the way. really beautifully. This book is stunning. Like, just absolutely gorgeous. So in the whales world, the abyss, what they call like open air, is actually down. It took me a minute to kind of like get my head around that inversion actually, but once I did and the pictures helped, it was actually quite interesting. And they hunt men, and they do similar things with men that the men do with the whales when they hunt. They break them down, they use their parts for different things. It's really interesting. So Bathsheba is part of a crew, and their captain, Alexandra, is obsessed with finding Toby Wick, who is supposedly this human captain that tortures whales and fruitlessly like kills them all, and is basically the like Moby Dick of the story. Ness takes it and starts thinking about just like evil in general, which I think is kind of in conversation with Moby Dick, and this is where I wish that Moby Dick was fresher in my head, because I think that he's saying some really interesting things, Ness is, about the nature of evil, about how we can create our own devils and then invest them with life. They're in conversation with each other in a really interesting way, and I highly recommend this one. It's very lyrical, it's very thoughtful. It certainly, you know, has a plot, but it's idea driven, not plot driven. So if you go in expecting that, I think you'll like it better. You certainly, again, don't have to read Moby Dick to appreciate this book, but I think it helps because it's so very deliberately engaging with Moby Dick on a number of levels, not just kind of like retelling. And it's not a retelling really, although the idea is similar. First of all, it's 150 pages and it's illustrated. So the last pairing I want to talk about is If We Were Villains and Shakespeare. If We Were Villains is a story about a group of theater kids who go to this conservatory that's really fancy. It's basically college, but it's a conservatory. And there's 7 of them left in their year. They're seniors. They're looking kind of forward to graduating, moving on, but also they have this last year to negotiate. And in the theater program at this school, they only perform Shakespeare. And so these guys are ridiculously familiar with Shakespeare. They even kind of like quote Shakespeare just as part of their normal dialogue, which I just think is fantastic and wonderful. I wish I knew Shakespeare at that level. It's brilliant. It's really brilliant. They have whole conversations like through Shakespeare scenes. It's great. The pressure's getting to them, especially to one of the characters, a guy named Richard, who's starting to be kind of abusive. Like, he's always been a jerk, but now he's getting abusive. And then Richard dies. And it's probably not an accident. And we know it's probably not an accident for sure, because the story opens with Oliver, the main character and narrator, getting out of prison for having done it. But he is met by the detective, who's now retired, who was working on the case, and he's like, okay, tell me the real story, because I don't believe the story that came out in the trial is the real story. And so this is what we get. We get the real story, and it's fascinating. Here's how If We Were Villains is kind of engaged with Shakespeare in one way. This is Oliver. He's trying, I'm reading a passage from the book. He's trying to explain to Colborne, the detective, why it's Shakespeare's fault for all of this. He says, we spent 4 years, most of us years before that, immersed in Shakespeare, submerged. Here we could indulge our collective obsession. We spoke it as a second language, conversed in poetry, and lost touch with reality a little. Well, that's misleading. Shakespeare is real, but his characters live in a world of real extremes. They swing from ecstasy to anguish, love to hate, wonder to terror. It's not melodrama, though. They're not exaggerating. Every moment is crucial. So this is in kind of a way how the author is engaging with Shakespeare. Not only using him as like an inspiration and also as just this like cool background thing, but the emotions and passions. The story itself is very Shakespearean. Even in its structure, it's divided into 5 acts, and instead of chapters, there are scenes. It's like a traditional novel. It's not doesn't look like a play, but that's how it's divided. So there's always a prologue, and then to each act, and then it's divided into scenes. So there are also a little more kind of like basic level. The book engages with Shakespeare in that we see snatches of performances from 4 different plays, and I think that's really interesting, and so I'm going to talk about those 4 plays instead of just like all 36. Let's talk about the 4 that the play actually talks about, or the book actually talks about. Again, you don't have to know anything about Shakespeare to appreciate this book, but if you're interested, if you've read the book and you like it, or if you're interested in the book and you're interested in Shakespeare, I would recommend like reading these 4 plays with the book, because they're the ones that most deliberately it engages with. So the students put on 2 major performances during the course of the year that the book takes place. The second performance, I'm going to move backwards, is King Lear. King Lear is about an old king named Lear. Surprise! At the beginning of the play, he decides that he's old and he is ready to retire as king. And so he gives up his throne he says he's going to give up his throne to the daughter who loves him the most. He only has daughters. Now, his youngest daughter actually loves him the most, but she's not going to lie about it. So she says, I love you as much as I love you. Whereas his other 2 daughters are money-grabbing, power-hungry people. And so they say all this extravagant stuff, and he ends up disowning his younger daughter and then dividing his kingdom between his 2 older daughters. And it does not turn out well. This is definitely a tragedy. Be prepared to be sad. Some of the important climactic moments in If We Were Villains come filtered through dialogue in King Lear. So it actually, like, I would recommend at the very least sort of like looking up a synopsis, because the subplot of King Lear, which is about a man named Gloucester and his 2 sons. So Edmund and Edgar become important, kind of. Again, you don't have to read it, but it adds to your level of understanding. The third play in the series is Romeo and Juliet. This one I think is maybe the least integral, but there is a performance of parts of Romeo and Juliet in the play. And so again, it's helpful to be kind of, or in the novel, so it's helpful to be a little bit familiar with this. You know what Romeo and Juliet's about, right? Right? So there's a boy named Romeo, and he sneaks into a party thrown by his family's most wickedest enemy, and he sees a girl there, and he's like, wow, that girl. And then they kiss, and turns out she's from that wicked enemy family. Then they get married, and it doesn't turn out well. Hello, tragedy. But the scene where part of this is performed is really cool. Speaking of cool, Macbeth, they perform some scenes out of Macbeth, and that is also a really cool scene. So at the school, the students perform, the seniors perform 2 like official whole plays, and then they do 2 like surprise kind of like real life spontaneous productions. So they each get assigned a part and specific scenes and lines to learn, and then they don't know who's playing the other parts in those scenes, and they just show up at this location. So for Romeo and Juliet, it's the like Christmas masked ball, and they kind of like perform in real time, which is just really cool. And then they do Macbeth on Halloween in the woods, and it's great. So Macbeth is one of my favorite plays, and it's the shortest of Shakespeare's plays. So if you're trying to get into Shakespeare, maybe try Macbeth. There are witches and ghosts and murder and hallucinated daggers. It's about a guy named Macbeth. He's a really great guy. Trademark, capital letters. He meets some witches randomly who are like, hey, guess what? You're gonna be king. And they give him some other prophecies too that come out to be true, and then his wife talks him into killing the actual king so he can become king like now instead of waiting to see what happens. And that's not a very good idea, turns out. So, yeah, I actually really like Macbeth. It's one of my favorites. I went backwards because the Shakespeare play that If We Were Villains most deeply engages with is Julius Caesar. So this is the first semester performance. Not only does it feature in some of the really important things that happen towards the beginning of the book, but also the book's structure is based on Julius Caesar. 5 acts, and if you know kind of like what happens in each of the acts, you can kind of see how it mirrors a little bit what happens in each of the acts in If We Were Villains. To say anything else would be spoilery, so despite being called Julius Caesar, this is actually should have been called Brutus. This is about how Julius Caesar was assassinated, and he dies at like the beginning of Act 3. But it's actually about the conspirators, especially one conspirator, Brutus, who kind of like has to be convinced to join the plot to assassinate Caesar. People still argue about who actually is the tragic hero, Caesar or Brutus, but in my opinion it's Brutus. So I hope you guys enjoyed this series. Let me know if there are any books that you would like me to talk about, or any like pairs that you would like to see me discuss. Obviously I will talk about ones that I have read. Let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you've read any of these pairs and what you think, or if you think you might pick up the like second book in one of these pairs. I'd love to hear about that. And that is it for this video. I will see you in the next one.